The wind howled through the trees surrounding the Ashbourne home, a once grand estate now marked by time and hardship. Snow blanketed the ground, muffling the sound of footsteps and voices within the house. But inside, the warmth of a fire crackled against the chill of the late December evening. The Ashbourne sisters gathered around the modest hearth, each lost in her own thoughts, though their closeness created an unspoken unity. Charlotte Ashbourne, or Lottie as her sisters called her, sat with her embroidery, her needle moving deftly through the fabric. At 20, she carried the weight of being the eldest with grace, though her heart often yearned for a freedom she would never voice. To Lottie, the family's survival came first, and she bore the responsibility as naturally as breathing. Across from her, Josie Ashbourne leaned forward on a small wooden chair, pen scratching furiously against paper, her brow furrowed in concentration, and occasionally, she muttered a line aloud, testing its rhythm. At 18, Josie's sharp wit and restless spirit made her stand out in the sleepy village of Willowbrook. She longed for the day when she could escape to New York and prove herself as a writer, though she knew such dreams felt out of reach in their current circumstances. By the window, 16-year-old Nora Ashbourne played her violin softly, the melancholy notes filling the room with a tender, bittersweet melody. Music was Nora's solace, her way of expressing emotions too delicate to speak. Her shyness often left her feeling invisible, but when she played, the world seemed to pause and listen. Millie Ashbourne, the youngest at 14, sat on the floor surrounded by scattered sheets of paper, sketching furiously. Her dark curls framed her face as she hummed to herself, oblivious to the quiet chatter around her. Millie had an artist's heart, always seeking inspiration in the ordinary, though her penchant for daydreaming often made her appear frivolous to others. Their mother, Margaret Ashbourne, entered the room with a tray of tea, her presence commanding yet gentle. Though her smile was warm, her eyes carried the shadows of worry. It had been months since word arrived from her husband, Walter, who was recovering in a distant hospital from wounds sustained in the war. The uncertainty of his condition weighed heavily on all of them. "Girls," Margaret said softly, setting the tray down on the table. "We've done well this week, but we'll need to be careful until the next payment comes in. I know it isn't easy, but I'm proud of all of you." The girls nodded, though the weight of their reality was never far from their minds. Lottie's job as a governess for the Lawrence family brought in the bulk of their income, supplemented by Josie's articles for the local paper. Nora had recently begun offering music lessons to the village children, and even Millie occasionally sold her sketches in the market. Together, they managed to keep the household afloat, though just barely, as the conversation shifted to lighter topics. The sound of hooves crunching on snow echoed from outside. The sisters exchanged curious glances before Josie sprang to her feet and pulled open the heavy front door. A figure emerged from the swirling snowstorm: Edward Lawrence, a young man of 21 and the heir to the Lawrence estate next door. His coat was dusted with snow, and his cheeks were flushed from the cold, but his usual charming grin was firmly in place. "Good evening, Miss Ashbourne," Edward greeted, his eyes twinkling as they landed on Josie. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all, Edward," Margaret said warmly. "Come in before you catch your death out there." He stepped inside, shaking off the snow and glancing around at the sisters. Edward had only recently returned to Willowbrook after years of schooling abroad, and his presence had already caused a stir among the village's young women. Josie found his wit refreshing, though she refused to admit how much she enjoyed his company. Lottie, on the other hand, was drawn to his quiet kindness, though she masked her feelings well. "I brought this," Edward said, producing a small package wrapped in brown paper. "It's for all of you, a little something from my mother." She insisted. Margaret accepted the package with a gracious smile and set it aside, though the girls' curiosity was palpable. They waited until Edward had settled by the fire before Josie, unable to resist, unwrapped it to reveal a tin of imported tea and a box of chocolates. luxuries far beyond their means. "This is too much," Lottie said, though her voice softened as she looked at Edward. "Please thank your mother for her kindness." Edward waved it off with a laugh. "She'd never forgive me if I didn't." The evening unfolded with light-hearted conversation. Edward sharing tales of his time abroad while the sisters listened, captivated. Even Nora, usually reserved, found herself smiling at his stories. Millie sketched him without asking, her pencil capturing the sharp angles of his face and the mischief in his expression. As the hour grew late, Edward rose to leave, but before stepping out into the cold, he turned to Josie. "I've been reading your articles in the Willowbrook Gazette. They're remarkable, truly." Josie's cheeks flushed, though she quickly masked her surprise with a smirk. "Flattery will get you nowhere, Edward." He chuckled and tipped his hat. "Good night, Miss Ashbourne. Ladies." After he left, the sisters exchanged knowing glances, teasing Josie about her admirer, but Josie brushed it off, her mind already returning to the story she was writing. For all her bravado, a small part of her couldn't help but wonder if Edward's praise meant more than she let on. The winter dragged on, bringing with it new challenges. Nora fell ill during a particularly harsh storm, her frail health a constant source of worry. Lottie worked longer hours, her hands red and raw from the cold, while Josie took on extra assignments to cover the cost of medicine. Millie, feeling helpless, poured her energy into her art, her sketches becoming increasingly vivid and expressive. Through it all, the Ashbourne sisters found strength in one another. They laughed and argued, cried and comforted, their bond unbreakable despite the trials they faced. And though none of them could see it yet, the winds of change were beginning to stir, carrying with them the promise of love, loss, and the pursuit of dreams. Spring arrived with a sudden burst of life in Willowbrook. The snow melted into rushing streams, and the bare trees sprouted fresh green buds. Yet, for the Ashbourne sisters, the change in season brought both relief and uncertainty. Nora's health had improved, though her recovery was slow. The color returned to her cheeks, but a lingering fragility shadowed her every movement. Lottie found herself more burdened than ever, juggling her duties as a governess for the Lawrence children with the increasing demands of running the household. She had little time for herself, though Edward's frequent visits often broke the monotony of her days. He came bearing small gifts for the family, books, pastries, and once, a crate of fresh oranges. His presence was a balm, though Lottie refused to let herself hope for anything more. Edward belonged to a world far removed from hers, and she reminded herself of that daily. For Josie, spring was a season of opportunity. The editor of the Willowbrook Gazette had praised her recent article about the struggles of local farmers, and she had begun corresponding with a literary agent in New York. Her stories, written in the quiet of her attic room, were a mixture of sharp wit and heartfelt emotion. She poured her soul into them, driven by the dream of one day seeing her name in print. But Josie's ambitions brought her into conflict with Edward. His visits, once a source of playful banter, grew tense as he began to question her plans. "Why do you want to leave Willowbrook?" he asked one afternoon, as they walked along the edge of the Lawrence estate. The air smelled of freshly turned earth, and the distant sound of church bells echoed through the hills. "Because there's nothing for me here," Josie replied, her tone sharper than she intended. "I want more than this, more than tea parties and polite conversations." Edward frowned, his hands shoved deep into his coat pockets. "There's more to life than ambition. Josie, what about your family? Don't they need you?" "They'll be fine without me," she said, though the words felt hollow even as she spoke them. "Lottie is practically a second mother to all of us. She doesn't need me underfoot." Edward didn't respond, but his silence lingered between them like an unspoken argument. Meanwhile, Nora's world had begun to shift in its own way. During her illness, she had taken to reading her father's old journals, kept in a dusty trunk in the attic. She was surprised to discover that Walter Ashbourne had once been part of a secret movement advocating for labor rights, a dangerous endeavor in their small, conservative village. The entries were filled with cryptic notes about meetings and names she didn't recognize. Nora, ever the quiet observer, began piecing together fragments of her father's past, though she kept her discoveries to herself for the time being. One afternoon, while organizing the music sheets in her small room, Nora stumbled upon an unfamiliar letter tucked inside an old composition book. The handwriting was her father's, but the letter was addressed to a man named Simon Blackwell. The contents were vague but hinted at a promise Walter had made years ago, a promise that now seemed to hold some weight over their family's current struggles. Feeling both curiosity and dread, Nora decided to confide in Millie, who had a knack for unraveling mysteries. Together, they began to dig deeper, uncovering bits and pieces of their father's involvement in a unionist circle that had been dissolved years earlier. But the discovery brought its own dangers. One evening, as Millie returned from a sketching trip near the old railway tracks, she noticed a stranger lingering near their home. The man was dressed plainly but had an air of unease about him. When she mentioned it to her sisters, Lottie dismissed it as paranoia, but Josie's expression darkened. "Did he say anything to you?" Josie asked, her voice low. "No, but he watched me," Millie replied. "I'm sure of it." Josie decided not to alarm their mother, but resolved to keep a closer eye on their surroundings. She couldn't shake the feeling that the stranger's presence was tied to their father's past. As the days grew warmer, Lottie found herself drawn more to Edward, despite her better judgment. One evening, after a long day of teaching, she walked home through the Lawrence Gardens and came across Edward sitting alone by the stone fountain. "You look tired," he said, rising to meet her. "Have you been working yourself to death again?" Lottie managed a smile. "It's nothing I can't handle." He hesitated before speaking again. "Lottie, why don't you let me help you? You don't have to do this all alone." "Edward," she began, her tone soft but firm, "I appreciate everything you've done for us, truly, but I can't rely on you. It wouldn't be right." "Why not?" he asked, his frustration evident. "Is it because of your pride? Or is it because of Josie?" The mention of Josie made her flinch. Edward sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "I don't want to make things harder for you, Lottie, but I need you to know that I care about you more than I should." Lottie's heart ached at his words, but she shook her head. "Edward, your life is here, with your family and your estate. My place is with mine. That's just the way things are." She left him by the fountain, her steps quickening as tears blurred her vision. She knew she had made the right choice, but it didn't make the decision any easier. While Lottie wrestled with her emotions, Josie received a letter from the literary agent in New York. It wasn't an offer for publication, but an invitation to submit more of her work. Encouraged, she began preparing a manuscript to send, though she worried about the cost of postage and the time it would take away from her other responsibilities. As for Nora and Millie, their investigation into their father's past led them to a surprising discovery: an old map tucked inside one of the journals. The map marked a location near the edge of Willowbrook, a place neither of them recognized. Driven by curiosity, they decided to visit the site, though they agreed to keep their plans a secret for now. Spring gave way to early summer, and the Ashbourne sisters found themselves at a crossroads. Lottie struggled to reconcile her feelings for Edward with her sense of duty. Josie stood on the brink of an uncertain future, her ambitions pulling her away from her family. Nora and Millie, drawn deeper into the mystery of their father's past, uncovered truths that would soon force the entire family to confront long-buried secrets. But for now, they carried on, as they always had, their hearts full of hope and fear in equal measure. The summer heat settled heavily over Willowbrook, wrapping the village in a haze of golden light and slow, languid days. But inside the Ashbourne home, there was no time for rest. Life moved at a frantic pace as the sisters found themselves swept up in a cascade of changes and revelations. Lottie tried to push thoughts of Edward aside, though his absence from the house left a hollowness she couldn't deny. He had stopped his visits after their conversation in the garden, leaving Lottie with both relief and a deep ache she couldn't explain. She poured herself into work, taking on extra responsibilities with the Lawrence children. But when Mrs. Lawrence began pressing her to consider a match with a wealthy merchant, an older man who could provide financial stability, Lottie felt her resolve weakening. Could she truly sacrifice her own happiness for the sake of her family? Josie, meanwhile, had sent off her manuscript to New York with trembling hands and a pounding heart. The days stretched painfully as she waited for a response. Her dreams seemed so close, yet the weight of responsibility held her firmly in Willowbrook. It was during this restless time that she noticed the stranger lingering near the edge of the village, a man who seemed to be watching their house. When she confronted him one afternoon, he offered little explanation, only a curt mention of business with her father. The mention of Walter Ashbourne sent a chill through Josie, and she shared her concerns with Nora and Millie. The three sisters pored over their father's journals and the map they'd found, trying to piece together the mystery. The map led to an abandoned mill at the outskirts of the village, a place Nora vaguely remembered their father visiting years ago. "I think we need to go there," Millie said one evening, her eyes wide with excitement. "What if there's something important, something that could help us?" Lottie overheard their conversation and immediately protested. "It's too dangerous. We don't even know who this man is or what he wants." But Josie's curiosity had already gotten the better of her. "We're not children, Lottie. We have a right to know what's going on." Despite her misgivings, Lottie relented, agreeing to let them go but only if she accompanied them. Early one morning, the four sisters set out for the mill, navigating overgrown trails and the whispers of the forest. The building was a relic of another era, its stone walls crumbling and ivy creeping through the cracks. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of decay. It was Millie who spotted the small iron box hidden beneath a loose floorboard. With trembling hands, they opened it to reveal a collection of letters, documents, and a small pouch of gold coins. The letters were from Simon Blackwell, the man their father had written to, and they detailed a plot to expose corruption among wealthy factory owners in the region. The pouch of gold had been intended as a bribe to keep Walter silent, something he had evidently refused to accept. The sisters stared at the contents in stunned silence, the weight of their discovery pressing down on them. "This is why that man is here," Josie said finally. "They're looking for this." "What do we do with it?" Nora asked, her voice shaking. "We keep it safe," Lottie said firmly. "And we don't tell anyone, not even Mother." Their return to the village was marked by unease. The stranger was waiting for them, his presence now impossible to ignore. He approached them as they neared the house, his dark eyes scanning their faces. "Miss Ashbourne," he said, his voice low and even. "I believe you have something that belongs to me." Lottie stepped forward, her chin held high. "I don't know what you're talking about." The man's expression hardened. "Your father made promises he couldn't keep. It would be a shame if his daughters suffered for his mistakes." Before Lottie could respond, Edward appeared at the gate, his presence a welcome interruption. He greeted the stranger coldly, his hand resting on the hilt of a cane sword, a relic from his own time abroad. "Is there a problem here?" Edward asked, his voice calm but firm. The stranger hesitated before stepping back. "No problem at all," he said, tipping his hat. "Just a friendly visit." After the man disappeared down the road, Edward turned to Lottie. "Who was that?" She hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. "Just someone from my father's past." Edward didn't press her, but his concern was evident. "If he comes back, you let me know." That evening, the sisters decided to split the documents, hiding them in different parts of the house. They didn't know what the papers contained, but they understood that their father's legacy, and possibly their own safety, depended on keeping them hidden. In the days that followed, life returned to a semblance of normalcy. Josie received a letter from New York, a rejection, though it came with words of encouragement and an invitation to revise and resubmit. The news was bittersweet, but Josie found solace in the knowledge that her work had been noticed. Nora, inspired by their father's bravery, composed a piece of music that seemed to capture the weight of their shared struggles. When she played it for the family one evening, the haunting melody brought tears to their eyes. As for Lottie, she finally made a decision about her future. She turned down the merchant's proposal, choosing instead to stay with her family. Edward's friendship became a quiet comfort, though neither spoke of what might have been. The summer ended with a sense of resolution. The stranger disappeared from Willowbrook, and the Ashbourne sisters felt a fragile peace settle over their home. They knew the road ahead would not be easy, but they also knew they could face it together. On the last warm evening of the season, the sisters sat together on the porch, their laughter mingling with the soft hum of crickets. In that moment, they felt invincible, a family bound not just by blood but by love, courage, and the unshakable belief that they could overcome anything.